hated my brother for abandoning me. Then he told me the truth about our father and everything changed. I never thought I'd be sharing something like this, but I feel like I'm drowning in confusion and could really use some outside perspective. I'm Simon, 17M, and up until recently, I thought I had a pretty normal family. We weren't perfect, but I believed we were close. Now, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. Let me start from the beginning. I grew up idolizing my older brother, Chris, 24M. He was everything I wanted to be: smart, athletic, and incredibly kind. When I was little, Chris was always there for me. He taught me how to ride a bike, staying patient even when I kept falling off. He helped me with my homework, explaining math problems in a way that actually made sense. When I started getting bullied in elementary school, Chris was the one who taught me how to stand up for myself. Our parents divorced when I was 8, and Chris was 15. I remember the night they told us. We were sitting at the dinner table, and Dad cleared his throat, saying he and Mom had something important to tell us. As they explained that they were separating, I felt like the floor was disappearing beneath me. I looked at Chris, expecting to see the same shock on his face, but he just looked resigned. Like he'd been expecting this. After Dad moved out, Chris became even more protective of me. He'd make sure I got to school on time, help me with my chores, and always had time to play video games or watch movies with me. On weekends when we visited Dad, Chris would suggest activities for all of us to do together, going to the park, playing basketball, or having movie marathons. I thought he was just trying to keep our family connected, but now I wonder if there was more to it. Things started to change when Chris turned 18. He became more withdrawn, spending more time in his room. I figured it was just because he was busy with college applications and his part-time job at the local grocery store. But even after he started college, something seemed off. He'd come home for breaks looking tired and stressed. When I asked if he was okay, he'd ruffle my hair and say everything was fine, just adult stuff I didn't need to worry about. About 2 years ago, when I was 15 and Chris was 22, he suddenly announced he was moving out. It came out of nowhere. One day, he sat Mom and me down and said he'd found an apartment closer to his college and would be moving at the end of the week. I was shocked and hurt. We had always been so close, and now he was leaving me behind. I tried calling and texting him after he moved, but his responses were infrequent and brief. When we did talk, he'd ask about school and my friends, but he never shared much about his own life. It felt like talking to a stranger, not my brother. I blamed myself for his sudden departure. Maybe I had been too clingy, too dependent on him. I thought if I changed myself, he might want to be around me again. I stopped playing video games, thinking he found it childish. I tried to act more mature, hoping he'd see me as an equal. But nothing worked. Chris remained distant, and I felt more alone than ever. As time passed, my hurt turned to anger. I was furious at Chris for abandoning me, for leaving me to deal with Mom's increasing mood swings on my own. After he left, Mom started drinking more. There were nights when I'd lock myself in my room, terrified of her unpredictable behavior. I'd hear her crying or yelling at the TV, and all I could think was that if Chris were here, he'd know what to do. I started to convince myself that Chris never really cared about me, that all those years of being close were just an act. Maybe he'd always resented having to look after his little brother. I deleted his number from my phone and unfollowed him on social media. I tried to erase him from my life, just as he had seemingly erased me from his. Last week, out of the blue, I received a text from Chris. He said he was in town and wanted to meet up and talk. At first, I was tempted to ignore it, to give him a taste of his own medicine. But curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet him at a local coffee shop after school. When I saw Chris, I barely recognized him. He looked older, tired, with dark circles under his eyes. His hair was longer, and he had a scruffy beard. He tried to hug me, but I stepped back. I demanded to know why he was suddenly interested in talking to me after 2 years of silence. Chris took a deep breath and started explaining. What he told me turned my world upside down. He said he left home to protect me. According to him, our father had been physically abusing him for years, long before the divorce. The abuse continued during visitations, but Chris never told anyone because Dad threatened to hurt me if he did. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our dad, the man who always brought us gifts and took us on fun outings, was abusive? It didn't make sense. But as Chris continued, more pieces fell into place. The times Chris would come home from Dad's place with unexplained bruises, claiming he'd fallen during basketball practice. The way he'd flinch when Dad raised his voice, even if it was just to call us for dinner. The relief on his face when Dad would cancel our weekend visits, saying he had to work. Chris said the abuse started when he was around 12. It began with harsh punishments for small mistakes, a slap for spilling a drink, being locked in his room for hours for getting a B on a test. It escalated over the years, becoming more frequent and severe. He said Dad was careful never to leave visible marks, and always had excuses ready if anyone noticed anything. The divorce, Chris explained, wasn't because of the reasons our parents gave us. Mom had started to suspect something was wrong and had confronted Dad about it. Dad had managed to convince her she was imagining things, but the confrontation had led to their separation. Chris said he'd hoped the divorce would end the abuse, but during visitations, it only got worse. Chris said he left home when he turned 22 because he couldn't take it anymore. He was afraid that if he stayed, he might snap and confront Dad, potentially putting me in danger. He thought by leaving, he could protect me from the truth and from potentially becoming Dad's new target. He admitted that cutting off contact was probably not the best decision, but he was scared and didn't know what else to do. I didn't know how to process this information. Part of me wanted to believe Chris, to hug him and apologize for all the hateful thoughts I'd had about him. But another part of me was skeptical. Why hadn't he told me sooner? Why cut off all contact? And how could I not have noticed anything for all those years? Chris said he was telling me now because he's engaged and wants me to be part of his new life. He also thinks I'm old enough to know the truth and make my own decisions about our father. He showed me a photo of his fiancée, a kind-looking woman named Sarah, and said they'd been together for a year. He wants me to be his best man at the wedding. I left the coffee shop feeling numb and confused. On the way home, I found myself replaying memories from my childhood, trying to spot signs I might have missed. I remembered a camping trip when I was 10, where Chris and Dad had gone on a hike together. Chris had come back with a limp, saying he'd twisted his ankle. Dad had been unusually quiet the rest of the trip. At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it. Now, I don't know what to believe or how to feel. Should I confront our father? Should I tell our mother? Am I a terrible person for doubting my brother's story? I feel lost and could really use some advice. How do you even begin to deal with something like this? Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since my meeting with Chris, and I feel like I've aged years in this short time. I've been grappling with whether to believe him or not. Part of me wanted to trust my brother, the person who had always protected me growing up. But another part couldn't reconcile this monstrous image of our father with the man I thought I knew. I decided to do some digging before confronting anyone else. I reached out to our cousin, Emily, 26F, who was always close to Chris. Emily and Chris were only 2 years apart and had been inseparable as kids. I remember being jealous of their bond when I was younger, always feeling like the tag-along little brother. At first, Emily was reluctant to talk. When I mentioned Chris's name, she got quiet and tried to change the subject. But when I told her about my conversation with Chris, she broke down and confirmed his story. She had known about the abuse for years but had sworn to Chris she wouldn't tell anyone. Emily shared some details that made my stomach churn. She told me about times when Chris would show up at her place in the middle of the night, bruised and scared. She described how he'd make excuses for the injuries, claiming he'd gotten into fights or had accidents. Emily said she'd begged Chris to tell someone, but he was always too afraid of what Dad might do. She also told me about a particularly bad incident that happened when Chris was 17. He had shown up at her house with a broken arm, saying he'd fallen down the stairs at Dad's place. Emily said she knew it was a lie because she'd seen the hand-shaped bruises on his upper arm. She had wanted to call the police, but Chris had begged her not to, saying it would only make things worse. It all started to make sense: the times Chris would cancel plans with friends, the way he'd tense up when Dad was around, the relief on his face when Dad would leave for business trips. I felt sick thinking about all the times I'd complained to Chris about him being no fun during our visits to Dad's, not realizing what he was going through. Armed with this information, I decided to confront our mother. I was angry that she might have known about the abuse and done nothing. When I told her what Chris and Emily had said, she broke down in tears. She swore she had no idea about the extent of the abuse. She said she'd suspected something was wrong, but Chris always denied it when she asked. She thought the divorce and the strained relationship between Chris and Dad were just typical teenage rebellion. Mom told me about the night she had confronted Dad, the night that led to their divorce. She said she had noticed Chris becoming more withdrawn and had seen some bruises she couldn't explain. When she asked Dad about it, he had flown into a rage, accusing her of being paranoid and threatening to take us kids away if she ever brought it up again. She said she'd filed for divorce the next day, hoping it would protect us. She never imagined the abuse would continue during visitations. Mom was devastated. She kept saying she had failed as a mother, that she should have seen the signs. She wanted to call Chris immediately, but I convinced her to give me some time to process everything first. I was still unsure about confronting Dad. Part of me was terrified of him now, seeing him in a completely different light. Another part still clung to the good memories we had, hoping there was some explanation that would make this all go away. I remember the time Dad had stayed up all night helping me build a model rocket for the science fair, or how he taught me to drive, always patient even when I kept stalling the car. I decided to meet with Chris again. This time, when I saw him, I hugged him tight and apologized for ever doubting him. We talked for hours. He shared more details about the abuse, and I shared how I'd felt abandoned and angry when he left. We both cried and promised to be there for each other from now on. Chris told me more about his life now. He's working as a software engineer and seeing a therapist to work through his trauma. He said meeting Sarah had been a turning point for him. She had encouraged him to seek help and to reconnect with his family. Chris admitted he was terrified of becoming a father himself, afraid he might turn out like Dad. But he said Sarah and his therapist were helping him work through those fears. Chris advised against confronting Dad directly, worried about how he might react. Instead, he suggested we speak to a lawyer about our options. He also encouraged me to see a therapist to help process everything, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet. As for Dad, I've been avoiding his calls and messages. He's left several voicemails, sounding increasingly annoyed about me not returning his calls. I'm not ready to face him yet. I'm angry, hurt, and confused. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at him the same way again. I'm grateful for Chris coming back into my life and for finally knowing the truth, but I'm also mourning the loss of the family I thought I had. It's a lot to process, and I'm taking it one day at a time. I keep thinking about all the times I idolized Dad, wanting to be just like him when I grew up. Now, the thought makes me sick. Mom has been incredibly supportive. She's been cooking all my favorite meals and trying to talk to me about what happened. I know she blames herself, but I don't know how to comfort her when I'm still trying to come to terms with everything myself. I'm trying to focus on school and my friends, but it's hard. Everything feels different now. I find myself watching other families, wondering if they're hiding dark secrets too. I know it's not healthy, but I can't seem to stop. I'm taking things one day at a time, trying to rebuild my relationship with Chris and figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I want to have with Dad going forward. It's a long road ahead, but at least now I know the truth. Update 2. It's been a month since my last update, and things have taken an unexpected turn. I've been spending a lot of time with Chris, rebuilding our relationship. It's been healing for both of us, but also challenging as we navigate our new reality. Chris has been telling me more about his life over the past few years. He shared how hard it was for him to adjust to living on his own, always looking over his shoulder, afraid Dad might show up. He told me about the nightmares he used to have, and how he'd wake up in a cold sweat, thinking he was back in Dad's house. It broke my heart to hear how much he'd been suffering while I was angry at him for abandoning me. We've been doing simple things together, playing video games like we used to, going for walks in the park, or just sitting and talking. It's strange how we can slip back into our old dynamic so easily, but there's also a new layer of understanding between us now. I'm getting to know Chris as an adult, not just as my protective older brother. About 2 weeks ago, Dad showed up unannounced at our house. I was alone, working on some homework in the living room, when I heard a car pull up. I looked out the window and saw Dad's familiar blue sedan. My heart started racing, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Dad banged on the door, yelling for me to open up. He was angry, demanding to know why I'd been ignoring him. I was frozen in place, unsure what to do. Then I remembered what Chris had told me about standing up to bullies when I was younger. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Dad barged in, his face red with anger. He started ranting about how I was being disrespectful, how he deserved better treatment from his son. Mom came home in the middle of his tirade, and tried to calm him down, but he was in a rage I'd never seen before. It was like looking at a stranger wearing my father's face. In the heat of the moment, I blurted out that I knew about what he'd done to Chris. The change in Dad's demeanor was instant and chilling. He went from angry to eerily calm. He denied everything, calling Chris a liar and manipulator. He tried to convince me that Chris was making up stories to turn me against him, that he was jealous of our relationship. For a moment, I almost believed him. He was so convincing, so much like the Dad I'd always known. He reminded me of all the good times we'd had together, the fishing trips, the baseball games, the times he'd helped me with school projects. But then I remembered the pain in Chris's eyes, the confirmation from Emily, and I stood my ground. Dad's mask slipped. He started threatening to cut me off financially, to make sure I'd never get into college. He even threatened to hurt Chris if I didn't set things straight. It was in that moment that I saw the monster Chris had described, and any doubt I had vanished. Mom, who had been quiet until then, suddenly stepped in. She told Dad to leave and never come back. She said she'd call the police if he ever tried to contact me or Chris again. I'd never seen her so fierce and protective. Dad looked shocked, like he couldn't believe Mom was standing up to him. He left, slamming the door behind him. After Dad left, Mom and I had a long talk. She apologized again for not seeing the signs and promised to do whatever it took to make things right. She suggested we look into legal options to protect ourselves and Chris from Dad. We contacted a lawyer who specializes in domestic abuse cases. She advised us to file for a restraining order against Dad. Chris agreed to provide a statement about the abuse he suffered. It was a difficult process, bringing up painful memories for him, but he said he'd do anything to protect me. The day of the court hearing was tense. I was nervous about seeing Dad again, but Chris was by my side the whole time. Dad showed up with his own lawyer, still denying everything. But when the judge read out Chris's statement and heard testimony from Emily and Mom, his face went pale. The judge granted the restraining order last week. Dad is now legally prohibited from contacting me, Chris, or Mom. It's a relief, but also surreal. I never imagined I'd need legal protection from my own father. Part of me still struggles with the reality of it all. There are moments when I catch myself almost picking up the phone to call Dad, to tell him about something that happened at school or ask for advice. Then I remember, and it's like losing him all over again. I'm still processing everything, but I feel safer now. Chris and I are closer than ever, and Mom has been incredibly supportive. We're talking about family therapy to help us heal together. Mom found a therapist who specializes in family trauma, and we have our first session scheduled for next week. I'm nervous about it, but also hopeful that it might help us move forward. I'm learning that family isn't always what it seems on the surface, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, no matter how painful it might be. It's a hard lesson, but I'm grateful to have Chris and Mom by my side as we navigate this new reality. Update 3. It's been 3 months since my last update, and life has settled into a new normal. The restraining order against Dad is still in place, and we haven't heard from him directly. However, we did receive a letter from his lawyer last month. Dad is threatening to sue for defamation if we don't retract our claims. Our lawyer assures us it's just an intimidation tactic and that we have nothing to worry about, but it still shook us up. Chris's wedding was last weekend, and it was a bittersweet event. I stood beside him as his best man, feeling incredibly proud of how far he's come. Sarah, his new wife, is wonderful. She's been so supportive of Chris and has even made efforts to get to know Mom and me better. During his speech, Chris thanked me for believing him and standing by him. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. The wedding also brought up some complicated feelings. As I watched Chris and Sarah exchange vows, I couldn't help but think about Dad. He should have been there, walking Chris down the aisle, giving a toast. But the man who should have done those things never really existed. It was a stark reminder of what we've lost, but also of what we've gained in honesty and healing. Mom has been going to therapy to work through her guilt and anger. She's also joined a support group for parents of abuse survivors. It's been good for her, and I can see her becoming stronger every day. She started volunteering at a local domestic violence shelter, saying she wants to help other families avoid what we went through. As for me, I've finally agreed to see a therapist. It's been helpful to have someone neutral to talk to about everything. I'm working through my feelings of betrayal, anger, and loss. Some days are harder than others, but I'm learning to be patient with myself. My therapist has been helping me understand that it's okay to mourn the loss of the father I thought I had while also being angry at who he really is. I've also been focusing on my future. With everything that happened, I almost let my grades slip, but Chris and Mom have been encouraging me to stay focused on school. I've started looking at colleges, and Chris has offered to help me with applications and financial aid forms. I'm thinking about studying psychology, maybe to help other kids who've been through similar situations. Our family isn't perfect, and we're still healing, but we're closer than ever. We've learned the importance of honesty, even when it's difficult, and the strength that comes from supporting each other. Last week, we had a family dinner with Chris and Sarah. As we sat around the table, laughing and sharing stories, I realized that this is what family should feel like: safe, supportive, and full of love. To anyone out there who might be going through something similar, don't be afraid to speak up. It might be scary, but the truth has a way of setting you free. And remember, family isn't always about blood, it's about the people who stand by you, support you, and love you unconditionally. Comments. User 1, NTA. Your brother is incredibly brave for coming forward, and you're brave for believing him. Stay strong, up. User 2, I'm so sorry you and your brother went through this. Your dad sounds like a real piece of work. Glad you're both safe now. User 3, family therapy sounds like a great idea. It'll help all of you process this trauma together. Wishing you all the best, up. User 4, your mom stepping up and protecting you guys in the end is awesome. It's never too late to do the right thing. User 5, the fact that you're focusing on your future despite everything is admirable. Keep pushing forward, up. You've got this. User 6, as someone who went through something similar, I can say it does get better. It takes time, but you'll come out stronger. Sending you virtual hugs. User 7, have you considered pressing charges against your father? It might bring some closure and prevent him from hurting others. User 8, your story is a powerful reminder that we never really know what's going on behind closed doors. Thank you for sharing and raising awareness.